LiSTNR production.
This content contains references to men's violence against women and child sexual abuse. Help is always available. Dial 1-800-RESPECT on 1-800-737-732. Former Commissioner of Victoria Police, Kel Blair, joined the force in 1957 and was deeply involved in some of the state's most complex and disturbing crimes.
One of the first things I saw was a car at the curb with the passenger door hanging open. There was a young woman sitting there with a horrendous head wound and obviously dead. And one of the things I vividly remember about it, the street light was glinting off the diamond of her engagement ring.
In this rewind episode of Crime Insiders, we begin with host Brent Sanders asking Kel about a body discovered in regional Victoria.
Call came through that a fingerprint expert was required at a scene of a murder. I jumped in a van and headed off to this country location. I passed the vehicle taking the body in the opposite direction and stopped briefly and consultation with the people carrying the body away. I then got to the country location and went out to the crime scene and had an examination of the crime scene. Fortunately, when I got down there was a beer can about 20 metres from where the body was, and it looked like it hadn't been there all that long, although it was 3 days from when the young girl went missing until the body was discovered. I managed to develop a fingerprint, even though there'd been intermittent showers. The can was actually sitting under a piece of bracken, which protected it a little. A fingerprint on the coloured M of a Melbourne beer can. And it's fair to say that the quality was very ordinary, and I couldn't do much with it on the spot, but the two young men who had picked this girl up had been interviewed by the homicide squad and routinely fingerprinted. So I took those fingerprints and the beer can back to Melbourne. The forensic photographer photographed the print and removed all the colouring from the background to make it much more easily seen. And I sat down and it took 5.5 hours before I was convinced that I had found the left middle fingerprint of one of those two young men. The homicide said, "Are you sure it's him?" And I said, "Yes, there's not a shadow of doubt. It is certainly the fingerprint of this particular fellow." As a result, although they'd been in and been discharged, they were rearrested. During the questioning, they initially said no, didn't know what the homicide were talking about and denied it. There was a young policewoman in the town who lived next door to one of these miscreants, and she went in to have a word with him, and he broke down and confessed that they had been responsible, and from that point it unravelled for them fairly quickly. There was a trial in Ballarat. I gave evidence at the trial, or was to give evidence at the trial, but when the jury was shown the photographs from the crime scene, and in those days they're all in black and white, to be in colour, which is a bit strange really, because when you go to a crime scene it's always in colour. One of the jury people became mentally unbalanced to the point where they had to be taken away, and I believe they never ever recovered, and the trial was aborted, so I went back for a trial later on. And I gave evidence of developing the fingerprint on the beer can, and counsel for one of the offenders, the one whose print it was, stood up and conceded that their client's fingerprint was on the can, and the can is from the scene of the crime. I was a little amazed at that, frankly. He couldn't really argue about the identification of the fingerprint, but I was a bit surprised conceded from the scene of the crime. But the defence seemed to be that they would blame one another and each would claim that they took no part. That actually led to some very strong case law when the matter went to appeal subsequently, and it was determined by the court that one could be an aider and abettor by mere presence. So it wasn't necessary to prove that they'd actively participated, although I've no doubt they both did, but that wasn't necessary to prove for them to be equally guilty. So that was very strong case law. Had it not been for the good fortune of having a piece of bracken keeping water off the beer can, we may never have ever solved that particular crime. It had an enormous impact on the family, of course. The parents were separated, they were devastated. Grandfather, I believe, died of a broken heart in a very short space of time with the loss of his little granddaughter, and it had all sorts of implications. The offender served very long terms in jail. The whole thing was just a horrible example of what people occasionally do, to kill someone just for the thrill of it.
We're talking here, this is the 1970s, and fingerprinting at the time was all manually done. Getting that print off the can, what's the process there back in 1970?
Well, the process there was to photograph the print. One can also lift latent fingerprints, had developed them with a powder so they're visible, and then lift them off with a sticky Perspex sheet. Very much manual in those days, or the whole process, rolling the fingers with ink on the form and so on. In New York at about that time, they were just beginning to develop a process to have computers search fingerprints. And of course, now that's very commonplace, and that saves an enormous amount of manual labour. There are only four main patterns in fingerprints: arch, loops, whorls and composites. And when they have what's called arches, that's the ridges flow in from one side of the finger and out the other. There's no other distinguishing matters except the individual identification points in the print, and so they take a very long time to manually search, whereas the computer can scan thousands of sets in just a few seconds, and usually throw out 3 or 4 or half a dozen, sometimes only one, saying these are the most likely. And then, of course, a fingerprint technician or expert determines whether they are in fact a match. But in each fingerprint, there are various characteristics. There are ridge bifurcations, there are ridge endings, there are little lakes where the ridges part and rejoin, and each of those have to be in true relative position and coincident sequence. In those days, it required 16 points matching in that coincident sequence in true relative position to determine they were for the same print.
The fingerprint in question, Kel, was found on a beer can in close proximity to the scene of the crime. That wouldn't have been the only thing dusted by you. Were you dusting other surfaces and things looking for the...
No, because the offence was in a country location out in the scrub, there was actually nothing else to examine.
Without the beer can, there's nothing?
Without the beer can, there was nothing.
Mm.
Because the two offenders had quite freely admitted that they'd picked this girl up, but they just said, look, they gave her a lift to another place and dropped her off. So, of course, any prints in the van would have been of no value whatsoever. Part of the way in which they could account for anything that was found in their van relating to the girl.
If you take the fingerprint out of this case, do you think there would have been any or enough leverage to get a conviction?
I don't believe so, because these two had been questioned quite extensively and released. There was no reason for them to be brought back in again for further questioning.
So you've got one print and it's sitting there in front of you. Can you just give us an overview of what you undertake in that process, Kel?
Well, there are literally maybe 100 ridges or more in a fingerprint, and it was a matter of tracing every one of those to see where they ended, where they bifurcated, whether there were other little sort of spots of ridges in between ridges and so on. So it was a very poor image, and it wasn't a matter of just looking at it and saying, oh, well, that's so-and-so. Because the quality of the image was such that it really took a long time to be sure that, in fact, what I thought I was seeing, I was in fact seeing.
You're at that point going, okay, 5.5 hours in, we've got it. I've got the match. There's got to be a process between that and then producing that in a courtroom to a jury as an understandable process of identification. Can you explain that to us?
Yeah, normally one would draw up a chart and draw lines to those individual characteristics, often, very often leaving some very obvious ones unmarked, because then the jury can find them for themselves when they look at the actual ink set and the actual latent fingerprint as it's developed. You can see juries saying, oh, there's another point. That makes it, I guess, more certain that there won't be any argument about the actual identification.
Now, Kel, when you take a fingerprint from a scene, from a crime scene, it can identify offender either by matching it with a future fingerprint that's taken once that offender is arrested, or it's matched back with an offender who has a previous arrest and all those fingerprints are on a police file. Is that correct?
It usually matched backwards, although there are cases, I can think of one classic one, where a rapist was leaving fingerprints all over the place, and ultimately someone internally connected that print with a double murder. And it was 19 years before the offender was arrested for a minor offence and fingerprinted. And suddenly, hallelujah, this is the bloke who's been committing all these rapes and is a double murderer. So the idea is to go through the collection and see if that fingerprint is recorded. If it's not, it's put aside, and periodically unidentified prints are run through the system again to see if anyone has been arrested and fingerprinted in the meantime.
Where does fingerprinting sit now in amongst investigative processes, Kel, as opposed to where it was in the 70s?
Still very high, because the fact now of computerisation has meant that latent fingerprints found from crime scenes, can be searched very, very rapidly. So it's still very much alive and well. DNA has been an enormous step forward, of course, but again, it doesn't help with identical twins. But generally, DNA gets to the stage of virtual certainty. But I guess technically, fingerprints are still the only absolutely positive means of identification. But no, the Fingerprint Bureau is still very much alive and well, and through computerisation, computer searching, now the number of offenders identified as a result of computer searching has grown astronomically.
Coming up, the Hoddle Street massacre and why that case stood out to Kel for its violence and senselessness, and one that shook him despite him being as experienced as he was.
If I could take you to 1971, there was a murder of a young child in Victoria, which was linked to a fingerprint found at the scene. Can you walk us through that case?
A young girl was sexually assaulted and killed, and her body was left in a builder's shed in a Melbourne suburb. I was called there with one of my junior colleagues, and when I looked in the shed, I found that a kiddie's book with a shiny cover had been thrown in beside the body. So I dusted the book for prints, and there were quite prominent prints on that book. I was talking to the homicide squad and asked if they had any suspects, and they said no, they didn't have any suspects, but there was an old fellow who lived over the back, but they had no reason to believe that he had any involvement. And for some reason I said, well, do you mind if I go and talk to him? And they said, no, go for your life. So I went over and introduced myself, and I spoke to this chap for a while, and then said, could I have a look at your hands? And he said, why? And I said, oh, just show me your hands. And he turned his palms up, and I looked down and thought, that's his fingerprint. And it was. So subsequently, he was arrested and charged with the murder of the little girl. He was actually acquitted because tests showed he had an error encephalogram, that he'd had a shrinking brain. So he was acquitted on the grounds of insanity, but of course he was never released. I couldn't help but think he would have been in better conditions for his incarceration if he'd pleaded guilty to the murder. But in any event, it was just a shock to me. The moment I looked down and looked at his hands, I knew instantly that it would be his fingerprint on the book.
Now, just tell me about that, Cal. What is it about looking at his hands and making that instant recognition that is definitely the hand of a print that I saw in that book. What was it about it that was just so pronounced?
Well, it had all the right pattern, but it also had all the little points that had sort of stuck in my mind from only a very short time before looking at the latent fingerprint. My eyesight was pretty good in those days, and as soon as I looked down, I could see that it was definitely his print. I mean, I took it away. I printed him and checked it, took it away, and went through the painstaking process of checking out the 16 points and heaps of others. But I was instantly sure that it was this person's fingerprint on the book.
And if we compare that, Kel, to the discussion with the previous case with the teenage girl, 2 offenders, this sounds to me like another case which hung on the identification of that print. If that print's not found on that book, I guess we could argue in time possibly the chap over the back fence, due to proximity, could have been seen as a suspect. But the print, was that the leverage to get the case into court?
It certainly was. It's a moot point as to whether he ever would have been identified and charged without it, because, as I said, the homicide squad certainly weren't looking at him as a suspect. And it's just in the lap of the gods whether they would have ever turned their attention to him to the point where they would have taken a set of his fingerprints.
No previous that would have alerted the investigators and thinking, hang on, there's a bit of a previous conviction trail here. No.
Obviously nothing to indicate that he had any involvement, and he lived far enough away for it not to be sort of immediately apparent that he could be involved. I don't know to this day why I asked whether I could go and talk to him, because I didn't want to intrude on the homicide investigators' duties.
That discussion that you have when you're sitting down with someone like that, Kel, there's a skill there in itself, particularly when you're sitting alongside somebody who has literally murdered a young child and they know it. You're a police officer. Now, you and I know that they don't have to talk to you. They don't have to say a thing. So it's quite a skill to converse with them and get some trust going there. Can you just walk us through that a little bit in this particular case?
There's always got to be a certain amount of empathy shown, whether it's the sincerity of it might be doubted. But I've found that a vast number of people have this desire to confess. They might need a little trigger here or there, something plays on them or whatever, and they confess. It's very difficult for many people not to make any admissions whatsoever. Some are good at it, never make admissions. Others aren't so good at it. You need to, the ones that are very good at it, you need to find other external evidence. One should never rely wholly on a confession in investigating. That can be a trap. I've had offenders confess to crimes they didn't do in the knowledge that they were in jail at the time of the offence. And of course, they might then tell you about half a dozen they did, but if they just throw in one where they've been incarcerated at the time, the whole thing's blown out of the water. So there needs to be corroboration. Every time someone confesses, there needs to be corroboration. And that's where the work starts to actually prove that the confession is true.
I'm interested in that statement that you made in your experience, goodness, 35 years in the job, Kel, that oftentimes people have a desire to confess, where that comes from or what motivates that, of course, is going to be different in different individuals. I'd hazard a guess too that an individual who has no previous history linking to this type of crime, who has deliberately or inadvertently taken the life of a young child, is going to be a person that bubbling below the surface is possibly a desire to get that out. That's a lot to hold in, isn't it? And yeah.
A lot of our unsolved crimes are actually ultimately solved, were unsolved, ultimately solved by the fact that someone, maybe even years later, makes admission to someone. Difficult, I think, for a lot of people to keep their mouths shut forever kind of thing. I had a particular instance in my home suburb when I was working there of a rather nasty rape of an elderly woman, and I spoke to 6 young people in a car about 3 weeks later and asked them if they knew anything about it, and they all said no, but after I drove away, one of them said that was me. and told all the others. And, of course, that got back to me. He just couldn't sit there and keep his mouth shut.
So, Kel, you mentioned that this offender was acquitted due to being declared criminally insane. Just wondering if you could just share with us what happens there, what happens to the offender at that point.
The process is that the perpetrator is then sent to a secure psychiatric institution because, of course, obviously can't be released back into the public arena. So the objective, I guess, has been achieved even though there's no criminal conviction involved. We've removed that person from society to a point where they can't do any more harm.
Sunday night, infamous Hoddle St massacre. Can you take us through that and your involvement in that case?
Yes, I had been into work and I was actually driving home and I was about 200 metres down the road from it when the call came through that there'd been a mass shooting. I drove straight into the scene. Fortunately, the shooting where I was had stopped. One of the first things I saw was a car at the curb with the passenger door hanging open. There was a young woman sitting there with a horrendous head wound and obviously dead. And one of the things I vividly remember about it, the street light was glinting off the diamond of her engagement ring. And a bit emotional about that, something I never got out of my head. I went down the road a few metres and there was a fellow sitting at the wheel of his car still holding the steering wheel with a big hole in his chest and he was dead as well. The offender had decamped in the sense that he'd gone north up the railway line from the railway station. The police helicopter was in attendance. There was a shot fired into the helicopter and it had to make a fairly rapid emergency landing because they weren't too sure what damage it had done. The perpetrator, he killed 7 and injured 19. He was tracked north and 2 young members in a car pulled up while he was behind a low brick fence. He fired 9 shots through their car, wounding one of the members slightly in the thumb. They jumped out of the car when he stopped shooting and he leapt up from behind the brick fence yelling out, put his hands in the air yelling out, "Don't shoot, don't shoot." Later on he claimed he wanted to experience combat. I'd never heard anything so ridiculous in my life. He wanted to shoot people. When someone looked like shooting back, he gave up like the mongrel dog he is. But it was absolutely horrendous crime scene because there were, I said, 7 dead people. One, a good Samaritan who came out to try and help someone else and was killed for their trouble. Very vivid in my mind still, I guess, particularly the young lady with the streetlight glinting off her engagement ring and this horrendous head wound. I've seen plenty of dead people and plenty of death, but in those circumstances, with the number and, of course, injured everywhere, it was even more traumatic, I guess.
Kel, I can hear the emotion in your voice. This is 38 years on from that incident, and yet you have clarity and a memory of that as if it happened yesterday.
No, but you can't unsee things, and when things are as horrendous as that, with the best will in the world, you really can't erase them from your memory. Now, I don't lie awake at night, sweating about it. I don't suffer post-traumatic stress injury. I've learned over the years to cope with these things, but just a little emotional about that particular, the young woman there who she had a little baby. It's one of those things that leads one to think that there has to be a great measure of gun control, and I know the USA battle every day with mass killings from not having any real gun control. We do need a regime to control the use of guns. And now, of course, we have machetes and knives predominating in violent crime. We really need to do better right across the board in relation to combating violence.
You were at the rank of Deputy Commissioner Operations in Victoria at that stage. I mean, that's almost as high up the tree as you can go. But 1987, Cal, you went to the top of the tree. 5 years as Chief Commissioner, Victorian Police. How would you sum up that time? Because that's a very unique role. There's no role like it. Deputy Commissioner is one thing, but Chief Commissioner, how would you sum up that 5 years?
It was challenging. I know in the first year, and I stopped counting after that, I was out 151 times at night speaking to various groups. Enormous strain on my wife and family, my wife and 2 daughters, but challenging and rewarding. I felt like I was doing something useful for the community. And, there were some bad moments. Wall Street, Steve Tynan and Damien Eyre gunned down. Absolutely shocking. Lost, the age of innocence really for Victoria Police. That was very tough, but I made a couple of major mistakes, in terms of dealing with that, which I freely acknowledge, my mistakes. But overall, it was interesting. I said every day was different. There was always something new. Dealing directly with politicians is always fraught with danger. But I reached a point where I felt that I'd achieved all that I really could for myself and for Victoria Police. My predecessor, Vic Miller, said he stayed too long. He was there in the end nearly 11 years. It's hard to keep the pace up day in, day out, because no matter how often I was out late at night, I was always in the office at 7:30 in the morning. And it was actually costing me thousands of dollars a year to go to work, because interest rates were very high. I'd reached the maximum I could reach for superannuation, and I didn't think it was fair to my family to keep working, to their detriment. So although I could have gone on for another 5 years, I'd decided that I would pull the pin early. I've lived over 31 years since, so I think it was probably a good decision.
Cal, I just want to thank you so very much for joining us here today via the Melbourne studio. 35 years serving the good people of Victoria. It's been a great pleasure to meet you, Cal, and I'm sure those that listen to the talk will take a hell of a lot away from it. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Brad, for having me.
If this content affected you, the number for Lifeline is 13 11 14. That's all we have time for in this Rewind episode. If you know someone who loves true crime, recommend our series to them. And check out our favourite clips. Search LiSTNR Crime on TikTok or Instagram. I'm Dan Mullins, with sound designed by Niall Fernandez. This series was recorded and produced on Gadigal land.